We know you can use tools like absolute and relative income thresholds to define households in an economy as in poverty. We even know that tools like the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient can tell us a lot about factors related to poverty on a macro level, like inequality across an economy. But how do you determine whether an entire country is in poverty? Well, the United Nations, the UN, had a measure called the Human Poverty Index, or HPI, which tried to capture the percentage of the population suffering from factors such as adult illiteracy, being underweight and under age 5, and expected deaths before middle age. It's notable that the UN derived different HPI measure, HPI 1 for developing nations versus HPI 2 for high income nations in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. But what makes a country developing? Taking a look at data from the World Bank, an international financial intermediary intended to get capital to low income nations, you can see that nations are categorized into four income groups. And for the purposes of your textbook, really just three. Every year around July, nations are either classified as low, lower middle, upper middle, or high income. And for simplicity, your textbook discusses the two middle groups as one combined group. These ranks are based on gross national income, or GNI, per capita, or per person last year in each nation. Most countries keep the same designation every year, even though the World Bank revises its thresholds annually. Countries that end up designated as low or middle income are often considered developing countries. And why did the UN have a different HPI measure for them? Because these low income or developing nations usually share common traits of socioeconomic relevance. First, higher than usual levels of inequality aren't unique to developing nations, but common among them. We can easily compare levels of inequality using Gini coefficients that consider the size of the difference between perfect equality and the distribution of the income in the country. Second, health and education investment tend to be a challenge for these nations. Unsurprising, since the highly developed nations offer immigration incentives for highly educated people, contributing to somewhat of a brain drain. Also, when fiscal troubles arise, international loan arrangements often push developing nations to cut back in these areas. More on this later. Third, unemployment tends to be high in these countries, especially because of the fourth point, that developing nations' economies tend to rely upon agriculture. Agriculture sectors are not high output per person, and although one additional person can add to the output, there are diminished marginal returns to every additional worker. More people means less money for each person. So people working in these sectors may not earn enough money per unit of labor to survive, and migration from the rural areas where agriculture is prominent toward urban centers is common as people seek out jobs with higher earnings. Few of those jobs exist because urban activity makes up a relatively small part of the economy, leading to higher rates of unemployment as more low skilled job seekers arrive. To many economists, these traits are seen as problems that are best resolved through a process called economic development. Now, economic development and economic growth are similar in that both involve the economy expanding in a way that could be visualized as higher levels of potential output or a rightward shift of the long run average supply, or LRAS curve. Different from economic growth, economic development entails a process of fully changing the makeup of the nation's economy. It usually revolves around shifting the nation from an agricultural to a manufacturing based economy, although some also develop into a more services based economy. That leads to a sustained and widely shared gains in per capita real gross domestic product, or GDP. But per capita real GDP isn't the only way to measure economic development. There was HPI that I brought up at the top of the video. In 2010, that was replaced by the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, or Global MPI, which uses 10 indicators to assess deprivation across health, education, and living standard dimensions. The UN also publishes what they call a Human Development Index, or HDI, that considers life expectancy, educational attainment, and purchasing power adjusted per capita GDP. There's also the Gender Development Index, or GDI, that takes those factors and adjusts them for gender inequality. What's interesting, though, about the global MPI is that none of its indicators explicitly measure poverty in terms of income per capita. There's a consideration of assets, but even that's more directly a measure of living standards and annual flows of income. Why wouldn't the UN factor per capita output into this index? Well, we know there are all those nasty problems with measuring output in an economy, like valuing domestic labor, not to mention that GDP data could be revised for years afterward. And per capita GDP is only used for nation to nation comparisons when measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, are included. But what's also problematic is that GDP per capita is dependent on the economy's population. And what we've learned from decades of data on the post colonial world is that there isn't a clean linear relationship between income per person and economic development. More on why next.